Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History webinar series. I'm Marin, and I'll be your host for this webinar. We'd love to know where you're listening from and how you heard about today's webinar. You can enter that into the polls on the left side of the screen. For today's webinar, we will have Kathryn Grant give a presentation entitled Ready for Temple Work, Top Tips for Checking Names in the Family Tree. For next week's webinar, that will be at 3 p.m. on Thursday. We will also be hearing from Kathryn Grant once more. She'll be giving a presentation entitled English Research, How Can the 1939 Register Help You? You always can contact us at our email, which is fhl_webinars@byu.edu. We've recently updated our website. We now have links to all of our videos, and that includes, so those links include the YouTube video as well as an alternative platform so that you can view those videos in church buildings and in family history centers. If you have any questions or would like to know how to access that, you can email us or you can go to our website. And our website is, you just can Google BYU Family History Library and it'll pop right up. And so for today, once again, our title for today's presentation is Ready for Temple Work, Top Tips for Checking Names in the Family Tree. Kathryn is a teacher, a writer, and a family history enthusiast. She enjoys helping others build their family trees and believes that everyone can learn to love and do family history. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library and presents at other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. Kathryn works for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a technical writer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and fresh raspberries. So as we are getting things set up for the presentation, and as Kathryn is just getting that set up, I'll bring your attention over to the left side of the screen. You can put questions over in the top left, and any comments you have.
It really is wonderful, but sometimes when something goes wrong, it does take a little bit of troubleshooting. So welcome to today's webinar. It's so good to have you with us to talk about this very important subject about determining whether names are ready for temple work in Family Tree. So let's take a quick look at the brief agenda for today's webinar. First of all, we're going to talk about why it's important to check temple names in Family Tree, and then we'll talk about what to check, and finally we'll give a couple of examples. So why to check? Let me start by sharing a little quiz. So is this true or false? Because Family Tree was created and is maintained, and I should have changed this, is maintained by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it is an official genealogical record which has been validated and is free of errors. Is that true or false? Well, probably most people listening to this webinar realize that that is actually false. But in the about 10 years that I've been a temple and family history consultant in various wards, I've discovered that that misconception is actually pretty widely believed in the church, that many people just assume, understandably, that the data in Family Tree has been provided by the church and that it's all been validated, and that all we have to do is go in and click a name with a green temple and we're good to go. And so in this webinar, we'll talk a little bit about why that's not the case and what we do need to do when we find a name with a green temple. So in order to understand more about where the names came from in Family Tree, I wanted to invite you to go back in time with me to meet one of my heroes. His name is Harry Russell, And Harry joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1912. He gained a strong testimony of family history and temple work. It was one of the bright spots of his life. He devoted much of his life to it. Well, as it happened, Harry got one of those books that sometimes are passed around in families. It was for his abbot line, and it had many, many abbot names in it. And so Harry was delighted, of course, to start doing temple work for those people. So he did 360 days worth of temple work, and I doubt that was, you know, days one right after another, but all told, he did 360 days of temple work in the Salt Lake Temple from this Abbott family record. And then he took a trip to St. George and discovered to his dismay that his family in St. George had the exact same book and was doing the exact same thing. So this was back in the days before the internet, and so I think it was actually very foresightful of Harry that he realized that if this happened to his family, it was probably happening to other people, and it was only going to get worse the more temples were built and the more people started doing family history. So he actually made a proposal to church leadership to create what he called a clearinghouse, a church-wide clearinghouse that would help avoid the kind of duplication that he had just experienced. So his clearinghouse ended up being called the Temple Index Bureau, or the TIB, and maybe some of you have heard people mention that. Basically what it was, remember, this is before the days of the internet, even before the days of computers, really. It was just a huge card file, and it was kept in Salt Lake City, and every card had the ordinances on it for a specific individual. So when they created the TIB, they basically got the records from I think, about 6 existing temples at the time and put them all together in this card file. And then every time a member of the church wanted to do temple names, they would send that request to Salt Lake City on a family group sheet or a similar form, and then assigned individuals would go look through the TIB, see if there were any duplicates, and if there were, they would write back to the submitter and say, oh, we're sorry, but this work's already been done. Or if it didn't look like there were duplicates, then they would tell the submitter to go ahead. So we could say that the TIB is the ancestor of Family Tree. So that is just a very quick overview of how Family Tree started. And of course, it's gone through different iterations. It's been called different things over the years, and now it's Family Tree. But if you want to learn more about how the system started and kind of the different things it's been known at over the years and the different features that it's had, there's a wonderful book called Hearts Turn to the Fathers. And the information, of course, is here on your screen. The book is available at Deseret Book and Amazon in ebook format. You can also find it online free in PDF format, but I found that the PDFs are just really kind of awkward and difficult to read. So for me, it's worth it to pay a little bit of extra money to get the ebook. And there may be some places that even sell the printed book, although I think officially it's out of print. Anyway, if you'd like to get this book, it's amazing, and I would strongly recommend it if you're interested in diving more into the background. Okay, so with that brief overview, let's talk about Family Tree now. If the church did not put in pre-validated data or pre-validated names into Family Tree, then where did they come from? Well, there's 3 main sources. The first is the source that we've already talked about. Harry Russell and the people he worked with gathered those early church temple records, including some extracted vital records. And just a comment on that, if some of you are wondering what extracted records are, there was a point in the mid-1900s where temple attendants could not keep up with the number of names that were being given to the temples by members. And so a proposal was made to church leadership to start what they called an extraction program. It was basically the same thing as our indexing program today, in the sense that volunteers would look at vital records and they would write down information about births or marriages or deaths. In that day, those names were given to the temples so that patrons who didn't have their own names could have names to do. The indexing program no longer serves that purpose, I'm told, but the extraction program did. So all those names were eventually put into what we now call Family Tree. In addition, LDS Church membership records were, information from them was added to Family Tree. And in the early days of the church, that resulted in a little bit of duplication because some of these temple records duplicated the membership records that were later added. And then a third major source that's growing all the time is just from ordinary users. Well, what's interesting about that, though, is that to say that there were sources other than users is a little bit misleading because all the information ultimately came from users, from people just like you and me, from regular submitters. So, in other words, those early church temple records, who gave the information for the temple work to be done? Well, it was the member who cleared the name. And for the church membership records, who gave that information to the ward clerk? Well, it was the member. I even double checked with the ward clerk and said, do you ever validate names or validate information that ward members give you? For instance, if a new baby is born, do you insist on the birth certificate? And he said, no, absolutely not. We take the member's word for it. And so that's, as far as I know, that's always been the case. And so LDS Church membership record data came from the members. And then, of course, the user submissions came from members as well. Well, what does this mean for us when we're looking at that data in Family Tree? There are a couple of things. First of all, it means that the quality of information varies widely. And do you know what? That's okay. Sometimes people get a little upset or concerned about that, but it's a commandment from the Lord for all of us to do family history, and all of us are going to have different skill levels. So we're going to have the longtime genealogist, we're going to have the intermediate researcher, we're going to have the new teenager or the new convert or somebody that's never done family history before, and we're all working together in Family Tree. And that's exactly how it should be, but it does tell us that we're going to have different qualities of information depending on the user, and all of us also build our skills as we go along. So for instance, some of the records that I submitted when I first started, I found out later that I'd made some mistakes, but my skills are growing, and hopefully I'm doing a better job as I keep going along and keep learning. Another thing is that duplicate names are an ongoing concern. And again, that's very understandable when you've got lots of people contributing to one great family tree, which is what Family Tree is. We don't have your tree and my tree. It's all one great big tree of all of Heavenly Father's children, or it will be when we finish it, right? That's what we're working towards. But the tree has to be one tree in order for temple work to be done, because you can imagine how confusing that would be for temple work if everybody was allowed to just have their own individual tree. And suppose we're cousins, so I have my copy of Grandpa and you have another copy of Grandpa, and it just wouldn't be feasible for everybody to have their own trees like we can on Ancestry or whatever and still track temple work. So a lot of people, in my experience, don't necessarily understand that right at first, and so they do upload duplicate names, not realizing that it's all one tree and that we don't have our separate little trees. So all that boils down to that it's always a good idea to validate a name that you find in Family Tree that has a green temple. Well, that leads us to the next question. If the church didn't populate Family Tree with pre-validated green temples, then why would a name have a green temple? We already found out that from the early days of the church, completed temple records were put into the TIB and then into eventually family tree. So how did we end up with some green temples? Well, there's a number of different reasons. One is that there are duplicate records in family tree and that one has ordinances attached and another one doesn't. Another reason is that not all of the extracted records got completed. So occasionally I do find an extracted record in family tree, and it's usually from the 1800s in a country that was heavily extracted like England. And so there may be one of those, like sometimes I'll find that the baptism and confirmation was done, but not the rest of the ordinances. Although I do have to say that very often, I would say about 98% of the time, when I find an extracted record that looks like it needs work, there is a duplicate someplace in the system. But I have occasionally found that there were records that really did need work and didn't have duplicates that were extracted. Now, here's another reason that is going to grow more and more common as more and more people get involved in family history, and that is that somebody added the name and they're in the process of reserving it, and they're planning to do the work. And then the last reason is that somebody added the name and they don't plan to do the work, and they're also not sharing it with the temple. I actually have a couple of very good researcher friends who are consultants who occasionally maybe they will research an in-law line that they are not supposed to do according to church policy, but they'll enter the names in family tree for somebody else to find. So that is another reason that you might see a green temple, is that somebody has put the name in there with no intention of doing the work. They just want to help people out. So that gives us an overview of where the green temples in family tree come from. Now let's talk a little bit about what to check when you get a green temple name. And you may, and when I say get a green temple name, maybe a friend has told you about it, or you have just stumbled on it in family tree, or maybe you've even gotten one of those emails from FamilySearch that says that it looks like you have a relative who may need temple work. So before we get into that, though, I did want to just talk briefly about the minimum family tree requirements. So these are the requirements that have to be met even before the green temple shows up. And I think this is useful to know what kind of requirements the system has. And as you see down at the bottom of the screen, that first asterisk, though this information came from a FamilySearch Help Center knowledge article, that hyperlink is not going to be active on the recording, but at the end of this recording, there will be a tiny URL that will take you to a page that lists the slide deck that was used for this presentation. And if you open up the slide deck, it's in Google Slides, then the link is clickable and you can go straight to that Knowledge Center article. So anyway, here are the basic requirements which Family Tree requires in order for a name to have a green temple. First of all, it does have to have a name. We can't do temple work for somebody that we don't at least have a first or last name for, and the full name is preferred if possible. And for women, that's always their birth names. Because in Western cultures where women change their names when they get married, you can imagine how confusing it would be and how difficult to locate duplicates if we used a woman's married name, especially if she was married more than once. And so the rule is for women, if their name changed at marriage, if in that culture their name changed at marriage, you always use their birth name. And actually, it's the same for any culture. You're just always supposed to use their birth name. You also need a sex for the person, so we need to know what gender they were. We need at least a country for at least one vital event. So if there's not at least a birth, marriage, death, or a burial, I believe, also qualifies, that has at least a country, then a family tree will not show that name as ready. Also, the name has to be marked as deceased, and that's kind of for obvious reasons, right? If you're alive, you do your own temple work, and the proxy work isn't needed unless the person has passed away. Also, no duplicates need to be found by family tree. So in other words, if family tree's possible duplicates function has identified any duplicates, then you won't be able to clear the name for temple work until those duplicates are resolved. You'll get a little message on when you try to reserve it, you'll get a little message. Then also for sealing to parents, at least the name of a father is required. And then finally, there should be no data problems. And look at the little second footnote down there with the double asterisks. That does not apply to non-standard dates and places. I have been able to reserve temple names with non-standard dates and places, but any other data errors, Family Tree doesn't allow you to reserve those names until those errors are resolved. And what do we mean by data errors? Those are actually logical impossibilities, such as one that I've mentioned in an earlier webinar where somebody had joined children born in the 1500s to a mother that was born in the 1800s. Well, that was not possible for that woman to have those children. So Family Tree says, wow, if we've got a mistake that's that obviously wrong, let's get that fixed before we even present a green temple for people to look at. So those are the minimum requirements, and if they're not met, instead of a green temple, you're going to see an orange temple. So here's an example. Take a look at John Gunton on this screen, and notice that over here on the left, he has no vital information, not a date, and not even a country, not any location. As we look over on the right, that little screenshot is from the family members section, and we see that he has a wife and he has a son. So as it happens, and I did a little research on this, but I didn't want to really belabor the point, and so I didn't do screenshots, but just take my word for it that I looked into this. And John Gunton was the son was an extracted christening. So, and it was in England. And when extracted christenings were done in England at this time, they took out all the information on the child, but they also took out the parents and included them to give the child context. Because to just put a person with a christening date, that's not as helpful as if you know the names of the parents. So the extractors would put the names of the parents in, but for English records in those times, they only included the names of the parents, so there was no other information for the extractor to take out, like where the guy was, or the mom or dad were born, or anything else like that. So that's all that got put in Family Tree was just the name of those parents. And it's actually a really great clue because you can use that to try and find more information. But until we've found more information, Family Tree will not allow that work to be done. So as you go to the tab, as you click on the tab with the orange temple, you'll see this little message here that talks about the information that's needed. So they need at least a a location for some vital event. And also, you see down here that they give the second bullet gives another helpful explanation that without just that minimum information, the system cannot at all be confident that there's not another duplicate in the system someplace. Here's an example of data problems. So look at the data problems on the right in that research help box for Elizabeth Ann Whitley. We've got a child being born before the mom, so that's kind of not going to work, right? We've got the birth before the mother could have children. I think those might be the same error, to be honest, generated by the same bad data, just that the child has a birth date before the mother's birth date. And then also we've got somebody dying before they got married. And this was back in 1620, as you can see from the date in the gray banner up there. So since the gospel wasn't restored by then, we're very sure that that was not referring to a proxy marriage, right? Not to a temple sealing. So having a death year before a marriage also doesn't work. So that being the case, if you try to reserve this name, you're going to get a message like this that indicates that there's a data problem and kind of a little more detail on what needs to be checked out before that name can be reserved for temple work. Okay, so those are the minimum requirements of Family Tree before it will allow you to reserve a name for temple work. Now, the purpose of this webinar is actually to talk about some additional requirements, and I want to be very, very clear up front. These are not requirements of FamilySearch. They are not requirements of Family Tree. They're not requirements of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're not requirements of BYU. And actually, they're not even requirements of me as a presenter of this webinar. I would categorize them more as suggestions or ideas or maybe recommendations for people who want to do maybe a little more due diligence on a Green Temple name that they find in Family Tree. But this is completely up to you. And also, when I'm working with people as a consultant, you want to be very careful not to discourage people. And so you don't want to. I remember one time I went into a family history center in California, and I won't tell you where because I don't want to be slamming anybody or criticizing anybody. But I walked in as a new consultant, and I had no clue what I was doing, right? I just wanted some help. And the consultant there, I am sure she had the best of intentions because nobody gets up in the morning and says, I really would like to make someone miserable today, or very few of us, not a sane person, right? So I know she had the best of intentions, but when I went in and showed her what I'd found so far, she just kind of got upset with me and said, I cannot allow you to do this work. And I started crying. Here I am, this new consultant that doesn't have a clue, and I felt like I was being rebuked for stuff that I didn't even know. And so we want to be really clear up front for anybody that's a consultant now. You want to be very, very considerate and very sensitive to the situation of any person that you're helping if they've, for instance, come to you with a green temple and want to know what they should do, or maybe they've already reserved it and they're telling you about it. We just always want to be as considerate and kind as possible, and also to not force somebody to do extra validation if they choose not to. We've got our agency, right? So these are suggestions that you can use if you would like to do this further validation. First of all, is there enough information to be confident that there are no duplicates? I'm not going to belabor these points because right now on this slide because we're going to go into each of these in just a few minutes in more detail. Did the person live to at least 8 years of age? Are there sources, and not only that, do they make sense for the person? When was the name added? Was it added many years ago, or was it added last week or yesterday? Those are practical things to consider. And then also, here's a couple of more things that are more on the spiritual side. And I know the Lord said in the Doctrine and Covenants that everything is spiritual, and that's absolutely true. But I think you know what I'm trying to get at here, that there are some more practical, sort of temporal things to look at, but then there are some more spiritual sort of things to look at. Is the person real to you? Are they more than just a green temple on that screen? Do they mean anything to you? Do you feel like they're family? And then also, have we listened to the Spirit? Are we really relying on the Spirit to try to help us determine if that name is really ready or if maybe we need to do a little more checking on it? And for me, that is absolutely the most important. You don't have to be an expert in genealogy. You don't have to be an expert in anything, to be honest. But if you've got the Spirit, you're going to go the right direction. That is absolutely the most important thing in doing family history. So checking for duplicates. Why isn't the possible duplicates function enough? Sometimes when I say this to people, they feel like maybe I'm being critical of Family Tree, so I want to be very clear that I'm not. The fault does not lie in Family Tree. In fact, there's not any fault at all. It's rather a function of how you decide if two records in Family Tree represent the same person. So here is an example that will help explain. The way that possible duplicates works is by comparing two records. If the records have lots of common information, then Family Tree flags them as a possible duplicate. Here's an example. On the left, we've got John Bescovy, who was christened on 18 March 1860 in Lincoln, Lincolnshire. He's the son of John and Eleanor Bescovy. On the right-hand side, we've got a record that is almost identical. Any changes or differences on this record are so minute as to be inconsequential. We've got March not abbreviated. We've got Lincoln, the county, or the shire, abbreviated instead of having shire on the end. And then finally, we've got a variant spelling of Eleanor's name. But any human being looking at this would say, oh, those are totally the same record. And Family Tree, with its algorithm, also can be confident that these are the same record because the differences are so minor and they're inconsequential. But that's not always the case. You can have two records that have less information in common, so they're not flagged as possible duplicates, but they still represent the same person. And so that's why it's so important to do our own duplicate searching and not just rely on possible duplicates. Possible duplicates does a great job of finding the low-hanging fruit, but if you want to be more confident, then it's a great idea to do your own duplicate search. So let's look at another example here. We've got our same record on the left, but now we've got a different record in Family Tree that Family Tree did not flag as a duplicate. And you can kind of see why. The last name is spelled differently. And my poor Bescovy family, oh my goodness, you've probably got families like this where the last name is spelled like 100 different ways. B-E-S-K, B-E-S-C, B-I-S, etc., etc. So here we've got a different last name. We've got a different birth year. Somebody estimated it. We don't even have an exact day or month. And we've only got a country. We don't have a parish. We don't have a county or a shire. And we've just got the dad's name. So this record does not have enough information in common where Family Tree can confidently present it to you as a duplicate. And I remember talking with a manager at FamilySearch, and he said, we're kind of walking a fine line here because we don't want to tell you that things are duplicates when they're not, because then if you merge them, somebody can get lost in a merge and then their temple work doesn't get done. So Family Tree is being responsible and only presenting us duplicates when there's a very, very high confidence that they really truly are duplicates. But again, there will be records many times in the system, depending on the family and depending on the country, where there will be duplicates, but the system will not recognize them because they don't have enough information in common. And that's where human brains come in, and also relying on the spirit. So when checking duplicates, what will give you the best chance of identifying a duplicate? Well, that is to make sure that you've got this information on that record with a green temple. You'll get the best results if you've got a full name. If you've got a birth date, at least a year. I found that you don't always have to have, or don't necessarily have to have, the day and month. It can be helpful, but I've been real comfortable with years a lot of times only on deciding if something's a duplicate. Also, having a birthplace that's more than a country is helpful. And relationships are very, very helpful. So having parents, spouses, and children, let me give an example there. There was a time when I was trying to determine whether there was a duplicate in the system for a John Bescovy. I ran possible duplicates and the system did not find anything. But I just, based actually on a prompting of the spirit, I had a feeling that I should keep looking. Well, I'd done enough research on John that I knew that his wife's name was Millicent Spray, and so that's kind of an unusual name. So I did a manual duplicate search, and by that I mean I just went to find in Family Tree and I entered John with his wife's name. Well, guess what? She came up. And so she and he were already in the system as husband and wife, in addition to this other name of John's that I had found. But because the two records didn't have enough in common, again, Family Tree did not identify them as duplicates. So the more you know about the family, the more likely you are to recognize a duplicate. Okay, second item, did the person live to age 8? And if not, that's important because then only a sealing to parents is needed. As we know, children aren't considered accountable until they reach age 8. So just as on earth, they don't need a baptism until 8. Proxies don't need a baptism, or you don't need to do a proxy baptism if the child did not live past 8. They just need to be sealed to their parents. Sometimes I've talked to people who have misunderstood that if the person is marked as deceased, that means they need all the ordinances. So here's the trick. Family Tree will mark people as deceased if they are over 110 years old. I should say on the old names that were submitted, they were marked as deceased, like before Family Tree, they were marked as deceased if the name was over a certain number of years old because they figured they've got to be dead by then. And the actual years varied a little bit over time. It's currently 110 years. But then also, when people add names, they may not know when the person died, but they do know that they're deceased, so they'll mark them as deceased. Well, if the person's marked as deceased, they automatically show up as needing all the ordinances if the other qualifications are met. So it is possible to see a green temple in Family Tree that has all the ordinances available, but if you do just a little more checking, you find that they died as a child and that they really don't need all the ordinances. So here's an example. This Ethel Smith, as we saw on the last screen, she was just marked as deceased and looks like she needs all temple work, but a little bit more checking for her death record shows that she actually died just a year after she was born. And so as soon as I put that death date in, those all the ordinances became unavailable except for the sealing to parents. So that was a good thing to find out that she did not need all those other ordinances because that meant that I could go ahead and spend my time in the temple doing the work for somebody who did actually need it. So the next thing on our list is to check and add sources. An example of this, well, let me not get ahead of myself here. The first thing to check is, are any sources attached? If they're not, that's a great opportunity to do a little checking and to add some. If sources are attached, do they make sense? Here's an example that I ran across when I was doing family history with my niece, Nicole. We were looking at a record and somebody had attached a burial record to a child. And we thought, oh, that's interesting. We looked at it and saw that the burial record was actually for a burial that took place quite a distance away in an entirely different county from where the child was born. Well, the child lived in England at a time when families just didn't travel. And so to have a child buried a long distance away was not very likely. Then we looked at a note that the person had added to that burial record, and they actually said, I don't really know if this person, if this is really the burial record for this person, it just has the same name. And so people will attach sources with the best of intentions, but they may not always be right. So it's definitely worth looking at the sources to see if they make sense. If there aren't any sources, are there record hints to add? If you've never tried to use a record hint or looked in other places for sources, Family Tree makes that so easy. So you might recognize these images that I'm showing down at the bottom. On the left-hand side, we've got the record hints. And in my experience, these are probably about 95 to 98% accurate. In other words, they really are for the person for the person whose page you're on. The algorithm that generates these hints is very strict because they want to be sure that they're presenting you with accurate sources. So once in a while, with a very common name and a big location like New York City or something, I might find a source, a hint that doesn't apply, but almost all the time they do. So it's definitely worth it. I mean, it's low-hanging fruit, right? You just click the name, or the name on the record hint, and it takes you to a place where you can review it, and you can just very easily attach it to the person whose page you're on. And if that record has any additional information, like maybe it has a death date that you didn't have before, you can add it right from the place where you attach the source. So that's an awesome way to add sources and add more information and get more familiar with your family so that you can be confident that you're really doing valid work. The other thing I love, and I think this is really kind of one of those best kept secrets, a lot of people I've discovered don't know about this. This search records box is also available on usually the right-hand side of the page. Depends, if you've made your screen narrow, it might be at the bottom, but for a normal width screen on a laptop or a regular monitor, it'll be off to the right. If you click any of these logos, it runs a search in the whatever place you click. Like if I click Family Search, it will take the information on the page and use it to search Family Search historical records. Same with Ancestry. If you've got one of those free accounts or a paid account for that matter for Ancestry, click the Ancestry logo on the person page and it searches Ancestry using the information on the person page. It's so awesome because you don't have to worry about retyping all the information. You just click Find My Past or click My Heritage or whatever. And as long as you've got an account with those people, and for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you will be able to get free accounts with Ancestry, Find My Past, and My Heritage. And of course, Family Search is always free to everybody, regardless. So clicking those logos is a great, fast, easy way to just find a few more sources. Okay, another thing to check is when was the name added? And this becomes important because with so many people working in Family Tree, more and more people are starting to come to me and express concern, frustration, even on occasion a little bit of anger, because they were right in the middle of working on some names and somebody went in and usually it's because they've used some kind of name finding app and they've run it and it just have gathered dozens or even hundreds of names. And those name finding apps, to my knowledge at least, at last I heard, they do not look at when the name was added. And so they just go through and reserve whatever names, but somebody might be in the process of working on those names right as someone else is reserving them. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes the person wasn't planning on doing them, but sometimes they were. And I've talked to people who were just so sad that like one woman needed the names for her children's temple trip. Another person wasn't currently able to go to the temple, but was trying to find them for family members. And so to be courteous and considerate of people that are working in Family Tree just like we are, I think that could only be a good thing. So the way that you can check to tell when a Green Temple name was created is that you go into the changelog. And the way that you do that is on the person page, go to latest changes and then click show all. And you're going to see a screen similar to the one that I've shown here. Now the entries in the changelog are in reverse chronological order. So in other words, the newest are listed first and the oldest are listed last. So the creation of the person is going to be listed last. So you want to scroll clear to the end of the changelog, and you notice on this particular one, this webinar is being given in August of 2018. So this person was just recently created. So personally, I probably wouldn't prefer to reserve that name without at least contacting the person who submitted it and just say, hey, I found this name and just wondered, are you planning on doing it? Because if you're not, I'd love to help out if you'd like some help with these temple names. But I think it's just a nice courtesy so that you don't, take the names that that mother was trying to reserve for her child or that person was trying to give to their family. And I just want to be really clear here. It's not against policy. It's not a sin. It's not, to reserve a name that somebody else has added. I just present it as a courtesy, just based on knowing that some people have been really hurt when they've lost the opportunity to do names that they were right in the middle of doing. And I have to say another thing, I've sometimes found Green Temple names that were a couple of years old. And in that case, I figured, the person had enough time that if they were going to reserve it, they would have already. So honestly, I don't even contact the person if the name is a couple of years old. But if it's a few days old or a few weeks old, I do contact the person. I think it's just a kind thing to do. Okay, let's move on to the more spiritual aspect of it. When you look at that name that has a green temple and it looks like that person needs ordinances, is that person real to you? Look at the person page and ask yourself, who is that person? Do I have any sense of who they are? Do I know how I'm related to them? And there's a really, really easy way to tell. If you just look in the gray banner at the top of the person page, there's a View My Relationship link, and you just click it, and it shows a chart of how you're related to that person. And what was life like for that person? When did they live? Did they live in the age of, modern technology, or were they maybe an agricultural laborer? Were they a miner? And that's someone who worked in the mines, not minor, a minor child. But did they work in the mines? That was a very difficult life. You can tell a lot from a person's occupation. What kind of work did they do? How many kids did they have in their family? Did they have a large family or a small family? Um, did the one of the spouses die early? You can really have some empathy for them when you see that maybe they lost a spouse early or they lost some children early. But take some time and really look at that person and try to get to know them just a little bit. And the best way, really, that you do that is through historical records and also through photos if they've been posted. This is actually that you see on the screen is my beloved third great grandfather, and I just love him and adore him and can't wait to meet him someday. He actually joined the church early in about the time of the Restoration and did a lot of temple work, and he set a great example for my family. So I just have such gratitude and tender feelings in my heart for him. But I have to say also, I have gratitude and tender feelings in my heart for other family and cousins that I found that I never knew personally, or they're not my direct ancestors, but I look at the records and I look at photographs and I see that they had struggles and challenges, and I just feel a great love for them. So you can get to know somebody even without meeting them through seeing information about them that is in Family Tree or that is in other records. So I would strongly recommend taking a few minutes, and it doesn't have to be, hours or months of time, but just take a few minutes and get to know that person a little bit before you reserve that name for temple work. I love this quote by Joseph Fielding Smith. He said, "It doesn't matter whether your computer is able to compile all the family group sheets for everyone that ever lived in the earth. It remains the responsibility of each individual to know his kindred dead and to study and become better acquainted with his ancestors." So let's look at some real life examples I found of green temple names and how I validated those. First of all, I'd like you to meet Nannie Card. So as we look at her information in Family Tree, we see that she was born in 1902, but there's no birthplace. We also see that she married William Ashley Barrett in 1928 in North Carolina. That's pretty much all we've got on her. We do have one source, and it matches the marriage, and it does give us a little bit of helpful information that the parents are W.H. and Martha Card. So now I've got a better idea of when I'm searching for duplicates who her parents were. But currently they're not listed in Family Tree. So I run possible duplicates just to see if there's any low-hanging fruit, and no duplicates are found. Okay, that's good, but I don't want to just stop there. So I do a quick ancestry search, and I discover that Nannie and William Barrett are together in the 1930 census 2 years after they got married. They're in the right location, they've got the right names and everything, so I'm very, very confident it's them. But here's some interesting thing I discovered just by looking quickly at that census. Now we got a birthplace. She's in North Carolina. So I would want to add that to that name before doing, or to that person page before doing the temple work. There's another very interesting little tidbit of information on the 1930 census. Her first marriage took place when she was age 16. Well, in that census, oh, I forget, but she's not 18. She's much older. I think she was maybe 32 or something. I'd have to go back and check. But from this information that her first marriage took place at age 16, we know that William cannot be her first spouse because she just married him 2 years ago in 1928. And finally, she's got a 12-year-old child living with her named Delphine Gilbert. And unfortunately, no relationship is given. All three of them are listed as roomers, Roomers. So they're boarding with somebody. But based on that information, then I was actually able to do a little more searching. And again, this wasn't hours of searching. This was like minutes of searching using Ancestry hints. I very quickly found another marriage record that was in 1914 when she would have been, actually, this is kind of funny. She, on the marriage record, says she was 18, but she would have been about 16, so I don't know if she fudged a little bit. You know, women often did that back then, I found. But anyway, we've got this earlier marriage record when she was about 16 years of age. It's also in North Carolina, and look at the spouse in the second bullet point. It's Aaron Zebedee Gilbert. So that the Delphine that was with them in the 1930 census is apparently her daughter from her first marriage. And the marriage record also shows that her parents are W.H. and Martha Card, which matches the second marriage record. So we do another quick search in Family Tree and look what we find. We find Nannie Card with Erin Gilbert. She's got the right parents. Well, we didn't know Martha's maiden name before, but her name's Martha. And look, we've got Delphine, or, well, she's not Delphine, she's, I guess, Daphne. And that's okay. That's close enough. Such an unusual name. So I'm very confident looking at this record here that there actually is a duplicate, and that the original record I found with the Green Temple doesn't really need the work because I looked at this record and her work is all done. Okay, so if I had reserved that name without checking, the duplicate work would have been done for Nannie, and most Family Tree users probably wouldn't realize there was a duplicate, so they would continue to think that those were two different families. So just a little bit of checking saved me actually hours of doing duplicate temple work, and it helped out other users because it gives a more complete record of Nannie. Let's take another quick look at somebody named Elizabeth Cresswell. So Elizabeth, I look at her record in Family Tree, and she's got a Green Temple. And the person who entered this did a great job. They added birth information. We've got a full birth year and a full birthplace. And then also, as we look down, we see that she's got parents. The parents have a marriage. The children are listed. She's got siblings. So as I look at this record, I say, okay, this is looking pretty good. I can see that the information is reasonably complete, and it looks like the person who created the record was trying to be careful with the information that they had. My first red flag is that I look down and I see that there are no sources, but that's okay. Maybe we could find some really quickly. So I do a quick search of Ancestry and GRO, and I apologize, I used the acronym because the whole big long thing wouldn't fit, but GRO stands for General Register Office, and that is the government office in England that has birth records. So I do a quick search on Ancestry and in the GRO, and this is what I find. I find nothing. I cannot find any evidence of Elizabeth being born. Now, she's in the census, so we know she existed, but I cannot find anything that indicates that she has an official birth record. Well, that is a little bit worrisome. Sure, maybe it's for a spelling mistake, but what if it's something else? So I'm going to do a little more checking. Well, it was pretty easy to find Elizabeth married in the 1911 census because her unmarried sister Annie is living with her. So it's very obvious that we've got the right family, and so we've got Elizabeth married, and the 1911 census says when she was married. It gives the years since the marriage or how long they've been married. So with that information, I was actually easily able to go back and find out marriage record says her surname is Timmons. What? What is going on here? So, the purpose of this webinar is not to go deep into the research, but rather to show how helpful just a little bit of research is. So, to make a long story short, this is what we discovered. So, we go back to Family Tree and we take another look at Amos, who is Elizabeth's father, and we discover that Amos had another wife, a second wife. You see her down at the bottom. Her name is Mary Martha Annie Wells. So looking at that, digging a little bit deeper into that information, we find out that Mary previously married Mr. Timmons. And anytime that you see that someone has a second wife, there is a pretty decent possibility that the other spouse was married before as well. In other words, widows and widowers often tended to marry each other at an older age. So Mary was previously married to a Mr. Timmons, and then I went back to the GRO, searched for a birth record under Elizabeth Timmons with a mother's maiden name of Wells, and she was right there. So all the time, based on the census record, the name Elizabeth Cresswell had been entered in Family Tree, but as it turns out, that wasn't her name at all, and she was hooked up to the wrong mom. So, and here's another little piece of information that was very valuable. As I looked in the changelog, and we saw this example earlier, I noticed that the person had created Elizabeth just a little while ago, just earlier this month. So I would not have gone in and reserved that name without checking. And actually, as it turns out, this user, is a distant cousin of mine, which is pretty cool. But anyway, if I had reserved the name without checking, first of all, work would have been done under the incorrect name. It would have been done under Elizabeth Cresswell when her name's really Elizabeth Timmons. She would have been sealed to the wrong parents, and not only that, this particular user was in the process of researching these names and planned to reserve them as soon as he had done the necessary research. So we are just about to the end of the webinar, but I want to make a few quick observations and then talk a little, kind of wrap up by talking about the importance of following the Spirit. Validating a Green Temple name really does take more effort than most people realize. Oh, and I did want to mention, I had actually hoped to share an example of a Green Temple name that was valid, but I didn't find any in time for this webinar. I have found them in the past, so I do know that it's possible to find a Green Temple name in Family Tree that is valid, that doesn't have errors, and that really does need work. But in my experience, it's the exception rather than the rule. And that's why I wanted to give this webinar, is just to give people some tips and hints for checking those names if you do choose to do that extra due diligence. So most Green Temple names do need a bit of cleanup. And it's important again to remember that green temple names are not, as I heard one person describe them actually from the pulpit, or actually I have to be honest there, my friend heard them and she texted me. She's like, you won't believe what somebody just said. But the person said from the pulpit that these were freebies, that they were all ready to go. And so that actually is not the case. And cleaning them up is an important task. So if you see a green temple name, that is an awesome opportunity to do a little more checking and see if that person really needs ordinances. And if they do, to go ahead and do them. And if they don't, at least to resolve the duplicates and add the extra information that will help make sure that those ordinances are not done unnecessarily. So I wanted to address very quickly two concerns. Sometimes I've heard people say that we only have two choices. They feel like if we ask people to validate green temple names, that we're just putting too high of a barrier in front of them and that we're going to discourage them. So in their thinking, the only option is to either click the name without validation or to force these poor people to do hours of difficult research and discourage them and turn them off of family history forever. But are those the only choices? I can tell you in my about 10 years of being a consultant, definitely not. In fact, what surprised me when I started working with people is how eager people are to learn how to validate names. They really want to know. They don't want to do invalid temple work. I've almost never, I can only think of actually one person who resisted when I suggested doing a little checking. And he's like, nope, it's got a green temple. I just want to do it. And that was his choice, so that's fine. But every other person I can think of is like, oh, yes, I'd love to. Please show me how. So the third option is to, if you've got the choice, work in a simple area. Don't throw somebody into like 17th century German handwriting to validate a record. If you find a green temple like that, and the person is a beginner, I would recommend just encouraging them to look in an easier place like 19th century England. And then just do reasonable validation and seek help if needed. Ask your temple and family or temple and family history consultant or your state consultant to just give you a little bit of guidance. Here's another dilemma that people sometimes say that, well, look, if you make people check a green temple name, then they're just not going to go to the temple at all. I've actually had people say that. That also is not true in my experience. People don't want to go to the temple and do invalid work. They really want to know that they're spending their time for somebody who really needs the ordinances. So those aren't the only choices. Again, the choices are understand the data in Family Tree and as much as possible work in a simple area if you're just starting out and learn to validate the names. And we've actually at the BYU Family History Library, we've got some other webinars on validating names. I don't remember the titles just off the top of my head. I apologize. I think one of them was called something like Tips for Getting Started, if I remember correctly. But look on our webinar page if you want more information on that. And if you're a consultant, there are also some good tips in the Discover, Gather, Connect webinars. So don't ever feel like the only choice is clicking a green temple without validation or just not going to the temple. That's just not the case. Especially with all the resources we have today, it is so easy to do the validation. We don't have to go to Salt Lake and sit for hours in front of microfilm. We click a few buttons. We look at ancestry hints. We look at record hints in Family Tree. We are really so blessed in having access to the information that we need to determine if a green temple name is really valid. Okay, final words here, the importance of following the Spirit. The Spirit can help you name or help you know if a name is truly ready for temple work or if there are duplicates or there are errors that need to be resolved. I can speak from personal experience and share with you my witness about that on multiple occasions the Spirit has helped me know that there were problems, and I'm sure that many of you listening have had that same experience. However, I was talking with a beautiful sister in my stake, a very spiritual, wonderful sister who, to my surprise, said, when I was explaining to her how we could rely on the Spirit in family history, and she said, but I'm not very good at hearing the Spirit. Well, for one thing, I honestly don't think she was giving herself enough credit, but a lot of us may feel this way. I know that there are times in my life when I do, and especially much earlier in my life when I was kind of still learning to recognize the Spirit. I did not feel like I was good at recognizing the Spirit. So, what do you do if you're in that situation? Is everything lost? Can you not do genealogy? Nope, not at all. So, I want to add my witness and bear my testimony, really, hope that's okay on a webinar, but of the importance of following President Nelson's counsel given in our most recent conference as of the date of this webinar to study the messages of this conference frequently and even repeatedly. That's from his talk, Let Us All Press On. And I just looked in the Sunday morning session and immediately found 3 amazing talks on how to recognize and how to benefit from having the Holy Ghost with you. So study those conference talks, study other amazing conference talks on the Holy Ghost, and that will be a great way to learn more. And what's so funny about that, okay, I was just listening to one of the conference talks the other day. I don't even remember which one it was. It may not have been this one on following this, one of these on following the Spirit. But I was listening to it while I made breakfast, and all of a sudden I heard something in the talk. And I was like, did he say that before? Was that because it was probably the 3rd or 4th time I'd listened to the talk? And I seriously did not remember hearing what I was hearing that day. So it's a wonderful benefit to have those talks online, be able to read them, study them, listen to them repeatedly, because I can promise you, you're going to get something new out of it pretty much every time that you listen to those talks. So it's going to help you learn more about following the Spirit. Do things that invite the Spirit. I know this will be familiar to most of you, but just kind of as a little list. Study the Spirit. Or excuse me, study the scriptures. Study the Spirit too, but study the scriptures. Serve others. Worship in the temple regularly, and pray specifically for the Spirit. Those top 3 things are activities when you're likely to feel the Spirit, so that gives all of us experience in what the Spirit feels like to us and how the Spirit speaks to us. And praying specifically for the Spirit, that prayer is so abundantly answered when we pray in faith. And then practice. I love this quote by Joseph Smith where I won't take time to read it, but just to sum up, he basically says, hey, if you get a prompting, follow it, and then when you find it fulfilled, you will know it was the Spirit, and you'll know a little bit more about how the Spirit speaks to you, and you'll grow in your ability to receive revelation. Then finally, from our beloved prophet, from one of his recent conference talks, nothing opens the heavens quite like the combination of increased purity, exact obedience, earnest seeking, daily feasting on the words of Christ in the Book of Mormon. Add my testimony to that too, because I felt the difference. If I skip a day, I can tell. And then finally, nothing opens the heavens quite like regular time committed to temple and family history work. So use family history to grow in your ability to recognize and follow the promptings of the Holy Ghost, and especially determine that you'll follow the Spirit as you prepare those names for temple work. So that brings us to our last slide here, just our quick summary. We talked about why to check because of the data in Family Tree and where it came from. We talked about what to check, both the minimum requirements imposed by Family Tree, the system, and then also some extra things that we could do if we choose to do. Then we talked about 2 examples where it was determined that some checking showed that the Green Temple names really didn't need work after all. Or excuse me, the first one didn't need work, and the second one needed some changes before the work would be correct. And then we talked about the importance of following the Spirit. So thank you everybody for joining us for our webinar today. I hope that's been helpful. And Maren, do we have any questions that we would like to address?
Yes, we have a question from Ben Bailey, Georgia. He was asking about um, I think it's Training the Hearts for Their Fathers
Yeah.
book that you were talking about. His question is, has it been thought to update the book mentioned to cover the years since 1994 to 2019? He just
Oh,
finished reading
wonderful.
it.
Great question. Because what's so funny about this is I actually heard a rumor that it was being updated, but then I emailed Brother Allen, the principal author, and he didn't know anything about it. So, about it being updated. And so, if the principal author isn't aware of it being updated, then it sounds like there at least aren't any current plans that he's aware of to update the book. I really wish they would update it. I think that would be an amazing thing. Maybe we should all email Ron Tanner, the manager of Family Tree, because he's got the background and knowledge. He would be a great person to update this book. He could do it in his spare time, of course. He's got so much of that, haha, as he's, making Family Tree better for all of us. Facetious there a little bit, but yeah, there are people who have that information, so maybe we should ask them to update the book. I think that would be very valuable. Thank you, Ben. Anything else?
Not that I'm aware of, but we'll wait just a few minutes and see if
Okay.
there's any more questions. All right, it looks like we're done with questions. I'll just move over to the closing screen. Just a reminder that next webinar is on Thursday at 3 p.m. on the 30th of August, and we'll hear from Kathryn again, and she'll be talking about the English research. How can the 1939 register help you? If you have any questions, you're welcome to email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu. Um, and of course, we will post all the links that were mentioned today from Kathryn's presentation. That will be posted on Monday with our YouTube video, and that will be available from our website. You also can view this video on the alternative platform. So if you'd like to show this in your family history class, or if you'd like to show this to anybody in a family history center, there will be a link available on Monday morning along with the YouTube video, so that you can view that on the alternative platform. Um, you're welcome to fill out the polls on the left side of the screen. We'd love to hear what feedback you have. And I hope that everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see you on Thursday next week.